Hello and welcome back to the Summit Studios YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how you can fix messy topology, how to clean meshes, reroute edges, and feel more confident dealing with your topology so it doesn't actually hold you back. So if you're new to 3D modeling and you've created your first 3D model, or perhaps you've got a bit more experience and you've modeled a few things yourself, but you're trying to push yourself, you may struggle with topology. More simply, the way the mesh actually flows, and perhaps that's holding you back, but don't worry, that's normal. It's a pretty tricky subject and it can be hard for beginners. So how exactly do you actually create clean topology? And that can seem incredibly daunting, but like I said, don't worry, it's really a lot simpler than it looks if you have proper planning and you take your time to do it right. Once you've got a bit more practice with it, it won't hold you back anymore and it will just become like second nature. So it's not exactly the most fun part of 3D modeling, but it is a really important one, especially if you want to get a job doing this. I'm recording this in Maya today, but this is applicable regardless of what 3D modeling software you're using, whether that's Blender or Cinema 4D or 3ds Max. So one of the first things I wanted to look at is something called edge redirection. Okay, and what that is essentially taking a couple edges and then redirecting them, hence the name, in a different direction. So there's a few different ways you can do this, and it really varies based on your mesh, but just to show you a couple of examples to give you an idea of what that looks like. So you see here, we just have a plane, okay, very simple model, literally one-sided, but we've got a few edges running in either direction, okay? We've got 3 edge loops going across in each direction. But what if, for whatever reason, over this end, we didn't want as many edges, right? These 3 are actually causing problems for whatever reason, and we need to get rid of those. Well, how can we do that in a clean way that doesn't create triangles or n-gons or anything messy? Well, what we can actually do is we can collapse some of these edges, these vertices, into one vertex. So I'm going to select these 3, hold down Shift and right click, and then go up to Merge Vertices, and then Merge Vertices to Center. That's now taken those 3 vertices and merged those together. We've got a few more to do here, so we'll just go ahead and do that. And you can see now that we have 2 quads here, a quad here and a quad here, but now we've got 2 triangles. Well, we can simply just go into edge selection and then delete that. And even though this looks like a triangle, it has 4 vertices, therefore it's a quad. So that's one way that you can reduce edges in that direction. You know, let's say we needed a few more up here, now we have more there, but we don't need as many here, okay? And again, this is very nuanced. This might not be applicable on all surfaces, especially not curved ones. This isn't going to be ideal, but on flat surfaces, this is very much doable. I do this quite often and it can help you. Another example is on a surface where we have even less edges this time, but perhaps we want to do the same thing. Well, what we could do is we could go ahead and delete these edges. Okay, maybe we want less down here. Always remember to remove those vertices as well, because we don't need those. And I'm going to go into the multi-cut tool, and from this vertex, I'm just going to hold Control and Shift to bring an edge out. Okay, we're going to put one there, and then I'm going to terminate that just in that corner. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side and terminate it in that corner. And then I'm just going to join those 2 together. So you can see what we've done now is we've just terminated those at either corner. We've created a few more quads, but we no longer have those edges going to there, but everything is still maintained nice and clean. So if we now needed to extrude off of here, for whatever reason, maybe we just need a quad, we can now do that, but we still maintain this kind of slightly higher, denser mesh here, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But you can see that we've done it a lot cleaner rather than just like potentially deleting edges, which is going to create n-gons and all sorts of messiness, and we don't want that. So part of one of the reasons why you might do edge redirection like this from time to time is because sometimes you don't want those same edges flowing all the way across your model, right? Perhaps you have some kind of detail further down there, and we'll get into a specific example of that later, and you don't need all of those edges down there. Maybe it will disrupt it. Maybe you have a circular detail where if you add more edges, it's now going to cause more problems. And then when you smooth it, it's not going to be nice and even anymore. Well, performing a edge redirection like this is a perfect way to reduce the number of edges heading in a particular direction. Not to mention, it can also just make things a bit more confusing if you have edges absolutely everywhere. You know, ideally, I think keep things as simple as possible for as long as possible. So if you don't need edges in a particular area, you can do some edge redirection within reason. You don't want to be doing this everywhere because, you know, sometimes you do need more edges in a specific direction. Sometimes you don't. It's really kind of up to you depending on what you're making. And I suppose that is the tricky part, is deciding where and when that makes sense. So we'll get into that in a minute. Another example as well is on a corner piece like this, a right angle. So we have this L shape here, and I've just added a few edges, some holding edges, some bevels to make sure this smooths nicely. Okay, and we get those curved edges, which it does. But you can see here we've got a few edges running here that we don't need all of these. Okay, it's not the end of the world if these stayed here, but if you imagine this was on a larger model and these edges were heading towards areas we might not necessarily want them, well, there's a way that we can clean this up because we don't actually need all of these edges. Right? If you think about it, to hold this edge, what do we need? Okay? To make sure we have a bevel here when we subdivide. We need this edge here on the left, this edge here on the right, and of course this edge here in the middle, but we don't need all of these extra ones running through the body of the mesh. So what I can do is go into vertex selection mode. Okay? I'm going to hold down Shift and right click, go to merge vertices, and then pick the target world tool. You can also get that just by going up to mesh tools, and target world is right there at the bottom. I'm then going to go ahead and just drag across and merge these ones into that corner. Okay, and then this is two sides, so we'll do the same on the bottom side as well. Then what I'm going to go ahead and do is just remove some of these edges since we no longer need them. Okay, and that's removed some of those edges. Okay, but we've still got a few here that we don't want. Okay, we've got two. We could condense this down into one. Now, some of you might have already figured out how we're going to do that, but if you haven't, well, it's quite simple. To begin with, I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. Okay, just want to make sure that we don't delete this inside edge. Okay, now we've got a big N-gon here, but what we can do is we can get the multi-cut tool again, select this corner, come to that corner, and then do the same on the bottom. And now you can see we've removed a huge number of edges, okay, but we have the exact same beveling that we needed. Okay, it smooths just the same, but it's so much cleaner now than it was. We don't have edges going off in that direction or any more than we had before. It's maintaining nice even quads, but without the extra headache some of those extra edges could have caused. And this is one of the reasons why I say that you should take it slow when you're doing these, is because there isn't particularly any rush, especially if you're trying to get into an industry or if you're just doing this for yourself. You know, take it slow. There's no reason to rush for it, especially if you're a beginner. Speed will come in time when you get more experience. Like with anything, it sort of becomes muscle memory. But if you take your time to actually think about where your edges are going and plan out, you know, oh, okay, I know I'm going to need a detail over here, so perhaps I do want more edges going in that direction. Perhaps you don't, you know, it really depends on what you're doing. So just think it out, plan it out. One thing I really like to do when I'm modeling sometimes is if I'm not sure how I'm going to do the topology on something, I'll literally just draw it. You know, I'll take a screenshot of this, I'll put it into Photoshop or Paint or whatever software you want to use, GIMP, and I'll just draw on top of it. All right, it's much easier sometimes for me to visualize the topology, especially on something more complicated, when you just go ahead and draw it out. And I think I've mentioned that in a few other videos, but it is genuinely really, really helpful. An example on a slightly more complicated surface here, you see we have a few details, some curvature here, but we've got these circular details here. So if we wanted to go ahead and add in a shape here, for example, okay? Or perhaps we want to create some sort of panel line. So instead of just grabbing the multi-cut tool and adding edges in here where you want them, you know, that's great. We've now created the space where we have it. You know, we could then go ahead and extrude that. Okay, cool. We've got our extension, our panel, whatever. But we now also have edges running down here and we don't want those there. Okay, so there's a number of different ways we could fix this, like we've already looked at. But sometimes you don't even need to do those. You don't need to add a couple extra edges there. You could literally just do a regular extrude, do the offset first, okay, adjust it to the size you need, right, and then extrude. And then you don't have to worry about having extra edges running through there. If you wanted to add a panel line, instead of adding an extra edge, you know, you could just use one of the pre-existing ones, right? So maybe if I wanted this to be cut in half, I could just select some of these edges, go ahead and bevel that. Select the faces that we want to be extruded inwards. Okay, and then just extrude. And now that's left us with a little triangle there, but that is quite an easy fix. We can go ahead and just add the edge loops when we need them to hold that. Okay, like so. So you can see now we smooth and that gives us a nice panel line. And you can see already there's no pinching whatsoever. But what we could do just to quickly fix this is we could select those three vertices and merge them, just like we did earlier on the edge redirection. Select that edge in there to delete it, That means we now have a little quad there, even though it looks like a triangle. And then we can just extrapolate that out and do the exact same thing. Okay, and smooth, and you can see we still have zero pinching whatsoever, but we've now cleaned up the mesh. We don't have edges running where we don't want them. And we've managed to add our panel line as well. So that's the topic of adding, like redirecting edges and making sure you're paying attention to edge flow. But something else I don't see a lot of beginners pay attention to is on curved surfaces and models in general, is if you need to have a higher density mesh, they don't actually stick to having even rectangular quads like this, okay? And annoyingly, it kind of can be that specific. Sometimes I'll see meshes where every single quad is kind of more like this. It's an elongated rectangle, which can be okay in some cases, but generally it's not advisable, mainly because they just don't subdivide as evenly. And if you then needed to take this mesh into a sculpting program, you know, maybe you're going to sculpt it up in Blender or ZBrush, for example, you need even quad topology for that, okay, to evenly subdivide. Otherwise, you're going to have difference in detail when you go to sculpt on top of that. This is especially important if you're working in a studio, or if you plan to work in a studio, be that game, VFX, or anything else, because you're only going to be one part of the pipeline, the 3D modeler. Okay, and you might even be sculpting on it yourself, so you're going to do yourself a favor, but you're going to be potentially and most likely handing this off to other artists, and you want to make sure that your mesh is nice and clean for them to deal with. That's why I think if you're a beginner, and again, this isn't so important if you're not planning to get a job in 3D industries, but if you are, I really would try and work to the same standard that these studios would expect, and imagine that you're going to be handing your work off to someone else, okay? You'd want it to be nice and clean. Like if someone handed you a model, you needed to sculpt on it, but the topology was horrible, you'd probably be quite upset, right? So it's better to have those practices ingrained now, rather than finding that out later. And of course, that's not always the case. Like with most things in 3D modeling, it kind of is relative and it depends what you're working on. For example, there's elongated rectangular quads on this bend here, just because there kind of has to be. Unless I was to increase the size of this bend, then maybe we could have more even quads. So from time to time, you will need to use rectangular quads. So that's just something to bear in mind, is that these rules exist for a reason, but it's knowing why they exist so that you can know when not to apply them, if that makes sense. What I mean is, it's all relative, it depends on your model, it depends on its use, and where it's going afterwards. One last thing I'd like to go over as well is actually, from time to time, n-gons and triangles are not actually a big deal, and that might surprise you, especially if you're new and perhaps other people that you're learning with, or you might have read online, or even your lecturers might have told you that triangles are awful and you should avoid them at all costs. First of all, that's not true. The computer sees everything as a triangle anyway, so despite us seeing this as a quad, basically at render time, the render engine doesn't care. This is all triangulated as far as it's concerned anyway. The area where triangles will cause problems is if you add ones like an individual triangle here and there on a curved surface. So you can see right now these are quads. If I just started going in and adding a bunch of triangles here for no reason, you know, but when we put some in here, something like that, and then I try to smooth this. Okay, all right, this is a bad example just because the mesh is even enough that it's not creating problems, but there could be pinching here, all right? So you kind of want to avoid triangles on curved surfaces, and especially on character models, right? Whether that's a creature or a human character, in areas where there's going to be deformation, because then they're going to be more obvious. Those areas where you really want nice, even quads. Areas where it isn't going to be as important is on a hard surface model like this, and particularly on flat surfaces like this, right? Like if this here was to be a triangle and not a quad, that's not going to create any problems whatsoever, right? That's completely fine. It might look a little dense if we were to go ahead and subdivide this a few more times, right? That looks a bit odd. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not the end of the world, and it's not going to break the model. So from time to time, quads are okay, right? An example of this, I could go ahead and delete this edge and then smooth this. There's basically still no artifacts whatsoever, right? So there are, you know, while that isn't ideal, there are times and places where you can break those rules and it's not going to create any issues. So yeah, I hope that's been helpful. Quite a short video today, but it's a very, very important topic. Not the most interesting one. I know it can be boring, but it is really, really important, especially if you want to get a job doing this professionally. It is something that is quite scrutinized, not as much as some people might expect, but at least to a degree that it's not going to hamper anyone else's work in the pipeline. So I think it's very, very important that you do pay attention to this. And it can even help you in your own work as well when it comes to texturing and sculpting, all that stuff, like I mentioned. So if it doesn't make sense straight away, don't worry at all. That is completely normal. It took me such a long time to figure out this kind of thing. And really, it's just one of those things. It's like a muscle, right? The more you train it, the more you practice it, the easier it's going to get. And I hope these tips have been helpful for you. I hope they in some way make things a little easier. The main important thing is that practice makes perfect, and the more you do of this, the more models you make, the more you pay attention to the topology, the easier this is going to get for you. One thing I noticed, at least in my own work, and especially over the years as I've done more and more of this, is that the more shapes you make, right, the more variants you make, the more varied things you make, you sort of develop almost like a catalog in your mind of the mesh layouts you'll use for each shape, what works, what doesn't, what you can get away with, what you can't, what creates artifacts and pinching and so on. So again, that leads into the whole practice makes perfect thing. And don't be too harsh on yourself if you make mistakes. You're still learning, and it's okay to make those mistakes because that's essentially how we all learn, right? So if you're beating yourself up thinking, oh, I can't get this right, that's 100% okay, okay? Take your time with it. Some of the best learning I've had when I've been working on models is just by making something that's a little bit too difficult for me, a little bit further outside of my comfort zone to the point where I almost can't complete it. And then even if you don't end up achieving the exact result you want, you still learn so much in the process that the second time around you do it, it's going to be so much easier for you, and you'll be able to make even more complicated things. Okay, so yeah, again, I hope that's been helpful. Remember to take breaks from time to time as well and go outside. That's also really, really important, and it's going to make your work better as well. And yeah, I guess most importantly, don't give up on it. So yeah, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to put those in the comments. Always love to see those. Email us as well if you've got any questions. If you've got any particular tricky topology that you're struggling with, you can email me, and I can take a look at that for you and give you any advice. Like and subscribe as well. That really, really helps out the channel. And if there's anything you'd like to see, please do let us know in the comments as well. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.